Provide a single piece of proof while you are sworn under oath. 7 seconds of absolute silence followed. That was the precise duration that the prominent figure, a man who had assured the American public on 400 in protest, 47 separate televised occasions that he possessed undeniable proof of international collusion, sat motionless before a microphone and offered no response. 7 seconds elapsed, with 28 million viewers tuning in and the solitary sound echoing throughout. The legislative chamber was the hum of the climate control system, accompanied by the faint scratching of a reporter's pen, drafting the exact word that would dominate the next day's front pages. Silence. The individual posing the inquiry was 39 years old, educated at a prestigious Ivy League institution, and speaking at a velocity that had compelled the official stenographer to pause him 20 minutes prior. It was the very first instance in her lengthy career that she had ever requested a speaker to reduce their pace. His name was Ben Shapiro, and he had not traveled to the nation's capital merely to engage in a casual dialogue. He had arrived armed with meticulously documented records. Merely 40 minutes earlier, it had appeared as though the seasoned politician was poised for victory. The proceedings had commenced exactly as the chairman had intended, firmly under his own command. He stood up, an action rarely taken by senators during such proceedings because standing projected an air of authority, and authority remained the final asset he had at his disposal. Mr. Chairman, he initiated his tone, carrying the steadfast assurance of an individual who has reiterated a statement so frequently that he has begun to conflate mere repetition with undeniable truth. I wish to be entirely transparent regarding the events that transpired and the rationale behind my actions. In the year 2016, a hostile foreign entity interfered in our national electoral process. That is not merely my personal perspective. It is the definitive conclusion reached by every intelligence organization within the United States government. They interfered, and that is an established fact. He paused, allowing the gravity of the statement to resonate. In my capacity as the ranking member, and subsequently the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I held a constitutional obligation to scrutinize that interference. I approached that responsibility with the utmost seriousness, and I would do so again tomorrow and the day following, because that is the duty of a Temet-12 patriot. The Allied side of the viewing gallery erupted into applause. It was not a polite smattering of clapping, but a forceful display designed to project dominance across the aisle. The chairman continued demonstrating his profound skill into this arena 2 decades in the Capitol had instructed him on, how to expertly navigate a crowd. Much like a surfer gliding along a wave, sensing the momentum remaining just ahead of the crest, and never allowing it to crash before the strategic moment. The official investigative report documented well over 170 instances of contact between the opposing presidential campaign and foreign-linked operatives. He stated, 170 is not an insignificant number. It is not a fabrication. It constitutes a pattern of conduct that any responsible leader would be obligated to investigate. As the applause swelled once more, his chief of staff, observing from the rearmost seats, permitted himself a subtle nod of approval. The situation was unfolding flawlessly, according to their strategy. The gentleman questioning me today is a media host. I hold respect for his platform and his viewership, yet independent broadcasts do not equate to formal oversight. Personal opinions do not constitute empirical evidence. Furthermore, I was privy to classified security briefings that this gentleman has never viewed and will never have the clearance to view. I formulated my assessments based upon that privileged information. I firmly stand by those assessments. And it is history, not a committee room, not a media broadcast, and not a social media timeline that will serve as the ultimate judge. He reclaimed his seat as the applause grew notably louder and more prolonged. This time, the presiding official was forced to strike his gavel twice to reinstitute decorum. Seated in the third row of the upper gallery was a 63-year-old gentleman from Youngstown, Ohio, named Richard Kovach. As he watched the chairman sit down, he experienced a sudden tightening within his chest. It was not fury that he felt, but an emotion far more ancient than anger. It was a profound sense of grief Richard had driven for 11 continuous hours to be present in this very room. He had departed Youngstown at 3 o'clock in the morning, paused just once for fuel in rural Pennsylvania, and arrived in the capital with barely enough time to consume a hastily bought sandwich in the cab of his truck. Before making his way to the Senate office building, he was dressed in his only formal suit, the exact garments he had last worn to lay his late wife to rest, paired with a necktie his son had gifted him for the holidays in 2016, which marked the final festive season. They had shared. He had not made this journey because he harbored a deep passion for parliamentary procedures. He was present because 3 years prior, on a crisp Thanksgiving evening, his son David had gazed across their family dining table and uttered phrases that Richard continued to hear echoing in the quiet moments before sleep. "You lend your support to a figure who compromised this nation to a foreign power." David had declared, "I cannot sit at this table any longer." David had then risen from his chair, donned his winter coat, and walked out of the cherished home where he had been raised. He walked past the old garage where Richard had patiently taught him how to replace a flat tire, past the wooden mailbox they had freshly painted together when David was merely 9 years old, and he had driven away into the night. That occurred in November of 2019, and the two had not exchanged a single word since. Richard sat in the gallery because the official who had just spoken the crowd was so enthusiastically applauding. It was the primary voice his son had trusted. Night after night, across numerous televised broadcasts. The official had insisted that the evidence existed, that the proof was direct, and that the conspiracy was hidden in plain view. David had internalized every syllable of those claims, and the weight of those words had ultimately cost Richard his relationship with his only son. The presiding chairman shifted his attention to the witness. "You may proceed with your inquiry." The media host did not stand, for he felt no necessity to do so. He simply opened a dark, heavily bound folder that was substantial enough to be mistaken for a metropolitan directory. He fixed his gaze upon the chairman with the distinct demeanor of time for years and fully intended to maximize the utility of every passing second. "Senator," he began smoothly, "have you concluded your remarks? I ask because I have brought the receipts." What unfolded next was a spectacle that no individual within that legislative space had ever witnessed during a formal proceeding. He did not construct a philosophical argument, nor did he present a subjective viewpoint. He offered no editorial commentary, engaged in no speculation, and provided no personal interpretations. He simply read aloud. Turning to the very first indexed page of his binder, he recited the chairman's own historical statements back to him, complete with precise calendar, dates, broadcasting networks, and exact timestamps. On the 20th of March, 2017, speaking on a major morning news program, you stated to the host, and I quote directly, "I prefer not to delve into the granular details, but I will affirm that there is evidence present that is not merely circumstantial." End quote. He turned the heavy page. On the 14th of February, 2018, on a prominent cable network, you informed the anchor, "I believe there is direct evidence of a coordinated effort." End quote. He turned another page. On the 4th of March, 2019, during an evening broadcast, you declared, "I believe there is an abundance of evidence regarding a conspiracy resting in plain sight." End quote. He turned one final page. On the 22nd of August, 2019, long after the special counsel's comprehensive report had been distributed and had definitively concluded that no criminal coordination took place, you looked into the camera and told the American public, "There is ample evidence of collusion in plain sight." End quote. He closed the heavy cover of the binder not because he lacked further citations, but because the foundational point had been unequivocally established. My research team dedicated 11 rigorous weeks to assembling every single public declaration you made concerning the existence of direct evidence of international coordination between March of 2017 and June of 2023. Reviewed televised interviews, press briefings, digital, podcast appearances, legislative floor speeches, and social media publications. We meticulously counted every single instance. The final tally was 447. He allowed the sheer magnitude of that number to permeate the quiet room. 447. Allow me to reiterate that for the official record, on 447 distinct occasions, spanning 31 different media networks over the a course of 6 years, you promised the American citizenry that you had personally viewed evidence, direct evidence, not circumstantial assumptions of a criminal conspiracy. Not once in those 447 appearances did a single media interviewer demand that you produce the physical proof. Not one journalist paused to say, "You claim to possess direct evidence, please display it for us." They inherently trusted your assertions because you held the prestigious title of Intelligence Chairman. And it is a baseline assumption that chairmen do not fabricate claims regarding highly classified national security matters. The interviewer paused, allowing a profound quiet to settle over the room, and when he resumed speaking, his delivery was painstakingly slow and intentional, as though the articulation of every syllable carried a heavy toll. "I am asking you right now, bound by your oath in the presence of this committee and the observing American public, where exactly is the evidence?" The chairman leaned cautiously toward his microphone, suggesting that the proof was already woven into the public domain, citing the 170 documented contacts, the notorious Tower meeting, and the alleged sharing of internal data with foreign associates. The questioner immediately raised his hand to halt the deflection. "I did not inquire about routine contacts. I did not ask about meetings. I did not ask about troubling behavior, vague patterns, or elements that rightly warranted an initial investigation. You did not inform the public that there were merely contacts worthy of scrutiny. You assured them that you possessed direct evidence of a criminal conspiracy. Direct was your chosen adjective. Criminal was your specific term. Conspiracy was your explicit accusation. I am asking you to name one solitary piece of proof. Just one. I am not asking for a meeting that appeared unseemly in hindsight. Nor am I asking for an ambiguous email that could be interpreted in multiple ways. I am asking for one concrete piece of direct evidence proving the opposing campaign criminally conspired with a foreign government. You repeatedly claimed you had it. You explicitly stated it was not circumstantial. You are currently under a sworn oath. Provide just one piece. The legislative chamber descended into complete silence. This was not the comfortable transitional quiet that normally occurs between scheduled speakers. It was a suffocating, heavy stillness, the kind of silence that places physical pressure against the eardrums, amplifying the mechanical drone of the air conditioning, the subtle electronic buzzing of the broadcasting cameras, and the collective sound of over 100 individuals consciously holding their breath. The chairman did not utter a word. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then 7. 7 seconds within a highly televised congressional hearing feels akin to an eternity. Observers could clearly discern the sound of a stray pen rolling across a wooden desk somewhere in the media enclosure. They could ported 40, hear the faint creak of a wooden chair as a spectator. In the upper gallery nervously shifted their posture. They experienced the unique, heavy quality of silence that only materializes when the powerful individual has been asked a question they are entirely incapable of answering, while everyone in the room recognizes their inability, and the individual realizes that everyone knows it. There was absolutely no avenue for retreat, as the microphone remained positioned a mere 12 inches from his face, broadcasting his hesitation to 28 million homes. The media host offered a slight nod. It was not a gesture of arrogant satisfaction, but rather one of solemn confirmation. Let the official record reflect that the representative has been granted the floor to produce the evidence he claimed to possess for over half a decade, and he has produced absolutely nothing. This is not because he has strategically chosen to withhold it, but because there is, in fact, nothing to produce. The evidence never existed. He spoke the words quietly, and almost gently adopting the tone of a seasoned physician, delivering a grim diagnosis that the patient had spent years attempting to evade. It was never there. And you were fully aware of that reality, because the highest-ranking witnesses explicitly told you so during the closed-door sessions of Abbas, 2018 and 2019. He continued his methodical presentation. Your own committee conducted highly classified confidential depositions involving senior intelligence officials from the preceding administration. These were the individuals possessing the highest clearances, the people who briefed the commander-in-chief every single morning. You sat physically in the room during those precise depositions. You initiated the inquiries. You listened to their responses. And because the resulting transcripts were shielded by classified status, those witnesses were legally barred from sharing their testimony with the general public. Only you possessed the platform to accurately characterize those proceedings. Allow me to share with the public what was actually said. He opened a completely different, heavily tabbed section of his binder. When the former Director of National Intelligence was asked under oath whether he had observed any direct evidence of a coordinated conspiracy, his recorded answer was a single word: no. He flipped to the next document. When the former Deputy Attorney General was asked the identical question under oath, her response was no. He turned another page. The former National Security Advisor, no. Another page turned. Former Attorney General, no. The final page was turned. The former Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, no. 5 distinguished names, 5 exhaustive depositions, 5 professionals who occupied the most sensitive intelligence and law enforcement positions in the nation. 5 individuals who possessed every conceivable political, personal, and institutional motivation to answer affirmatively. Yet, under oath, behind securely locked doors, far from the gaze of cameras or constituents, every single one of them said no. The rhythmic delivery of these facts was entirely intentional. The speaker fully comprehended the architecture of his argument. Every no served as a heavy brick, systematically constructing an impenetrable wall. Trapped on the opposing side of that wall was the chairman, a man who had been physically present in the room for every single testimony, who had absorbed every single denial, and who had subsequently walked out of those secure facilities only to appear on national television and confidently declare the exact opposite. You were present for those crucial depositions. You heard the director say, no. You heard the Deputy Attorney General say, no. You heard the National Security Advisor say, no. You listened as every single one of them stated, no. Yet the Provideness stated, following morning, and in some instances, the very next day, you appeared on major news networks and informed respected anchors that you had personally seen direct evidence of a conspiracy. You absorbed the absolute truth in private, and then you broadcasted the absolute opposite to the public. Because those transcripts were heavily classified, no individual possessed the ability to publicly contradict your narrative. The witnesses were legally shackled by security clearances and could not step forward to correct the record. You were entirely unburdened by anything other than your own internal conscience, and it appears your conscience proved to be an insufficient restraint. High up in the viewing gallery, Richard Kovach pressed his rough palm firmly against his forehead. He was internally processing a heartbreaking equation. It was not a complex calculation. Rather, it was the simple, agonizing arithmetic of a grieving father who had lost his only child over an absolute falsehood. If the official truly knew, if he had been thoroughly aware that the evidence was non-existent, and if sworn witnesses had explicitly informed him that they had observed nothing, then the bitter conflict that had shattered Richard's family was entirely baseless. The passionate argument his son had presented across the Thanksgiving table, the dispute that had permanently emptied a seat that had been warmly occupied for 31 years was not merely a subjective disagreement. It was not a routine difference of political philosophy, nor was it the predictable friction that exists between different generations. It was a fabricated lie. It was a falsehood perpetuated by a polished man, sitting 12 feet below, clad in a custom suit that likely cost more than Richard's entire monthly pension, whose political stature had been largely constructed upon 447 repetitions of a claim that top officials had explicitly told him was factually bankrupt. Richard stared intently down at the chairman. The politician was currently staring down at his own hands. His fingers were tightly intertwined, resting upon the wooden table, his knuckles showing white, the universal posture of a man, desperately attempting to prevent his hands from visibly trembling. Richard's mind drifted back to David. He recalled the specific way David had looked at him across that holiday dinner. It had not been a look of fiery anger, but something infinitely more devastating, profound disappointment. It was the unique, quiet disappointment of a son who genuinely believes his father has betrayed their homeland. It was a disappointment so deeply rooted that it rendered them unable to share a meal, inhabit the pie, a same house, or celebrate a shared holiday. And every painful consequence, every quiet Christmas morning, every unreturned text message, every birthday that slipped by without a familiar voice on the line, had been solidly built upon a foundation of accusations that 5 sworn witnesses had explicitly denied. The questioner then announced his first witness. The spoken name resonated with very few individuals seated in the general gallery, yet it carried immense significance for anyone who had closely tracked the intelligence investigations from their inception. I call Carter Page to the table. The figure who approached the designated witness chair defied the public's general expectations. He did not appear wrathful, nor did he exude bitterness. He was a far cry from the unhinged, wild-eyed conspirator that half a sentence decade of relentless cable news coverage had painted him to be. Instead, he was a tall, slightly stooped gentleman wearing a subdued gray suit, moving with the deliberate, cautious grace of a person who had learned through immense personal agony that every public movement he made would be hyper-analyzed, misconstrued, and weaponized against him. He took his seat and gently adjusted the microphone. When he finally spoke, his vocal tone was incredibly soft. A quietness, born not of inherent shyness, but of a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was the weariness of a citizen who had dedicated 6 years of his life to defending himself against an allegation that had never held a shred of truth. My name is Carter Page. I am a proud graduate of the United States Naval Academy, representing the class of 1993. I honorably served this nation as a naval intelligence officer. In the year 2013, I actively assisted federal law enforcement in constructing a legitimate case against a foreign espionage ring. Operating within New York, I aided my government in apprehending genuine hostile agents. He paused, drawing a slow, measured breath. In 2016, I offered my services as an unpaid volunteer, foreign policy advisor to a presidential campaign. During that tenure, I attended exactly one meeting and delivered a single speech overseas, an event I proactively reported to the campaign leadership beforehand. As a direct consequence of these standard actions, federal authorities procured a highly secretive surveillance warrant against me. For over 2 years, they comprehensively monitored my personal communications, my private emails, my telephone conversations, and my daily physical movements. I was never formally charged with any criminal offense. I was never indicted. I was not even granted the dignity of an interview by the special counsel's investigative team. Following 24 months of the most invasive, sweeping surveillance inflicted upon a private citizen, they uncovered absolutely nothing, because there was absolutely nothing to uncover. But by the time that truth emerged, the damage was completely irreversible. His voice subtly shifted, growing thinner rather than louder, adopting the fragile quality of someone struggling to contain an immense sorrow they had suppressed for far too long. I permanently lost my professional career. I had spent 15 years painstakingly building a successful consulting practice. It completely evaporated within mere months of the surveillance warrant leaking to the press. No corporate entity was willing to hire an individual that major newspapers had publicly branded as a foreign asset. I lost my life savings. Mounting legal defense fees consumed every asset to my name. I lost long-standing friends who ultimately concluded that it was safer to stop returning my calls than to risk association with a man the intelligence chairman had publicly declared compromised by a hostile power. Furthermore, my mother is 78 years of age, living quietly alone in a small rural town. Aggressive journalists would phone her residence 20 to 30 times a day. They incessantly knocked on her front door and physically camped out in her driveway, aggressively demanding to know if the son she raised was guilty of treason. She eventually stopped answering her telephone entirely. She became terrified to open her own front door. A 78-year-old widow was left trembling in isolation, simply because a sitting member of the United States Congress appeared on national television and heavily implied that her child was an active spy. The vast hearing room fell into a deeply uncomfortable stillness. I honorably served my country in the armed forces. I actively helped federal agencies capture real threats to our security. In return, my own government aimed its immense surveillance apparatus directly at me, relying on a warrant that was secured using a discredited dossier. That document was funded by a rival political campaign, assembled by a foreign national, and sourced from an individual who later confessed to federal agents that he had merely been speculating. Yet, the senator seated in contention, this very room authored an official memorandum, a document heavily praised by leading publications and echoed across news networks for months, insisting that the surveillance warrant was flawlessly obtained, that law enforcement had committed no errors, and that the entire process was perfectly sound. Carter Page turned his head and looked directly at the chairman. It was the singular moment during his harrowing testimony where he established direct eye contact. The process was not perfectly sound, Senator. The interviewer allowed the immense weight of the testimony to linger in the air for 10 full seconds before breaking the quiet. Mr. Chairman, I respectfully request to submit into the official record the comprehensive findings published by the Inspector General in December of 2019. The Port 8. Inspector General meticulously reviewed the surveillance applications utilized to monitor this citizen. He officially documented 17 highly significant errors and intentional omissions. Not a minor oversight of 1 or 2 details, but 17 severe breaches. Among these alarming errors, the investigating agency actively concealed from the secret court that their primary intelligence source was being financially compensated by a 10-by-2 rival political campaign. They hid the fact that this source had previously been terminated for engaging in unauthorized media leaks. They purposefully suppressed exculpatory evidence that would have cleared Mr. Page. Furthermore, an actual federal attorney formally pleaded guilty to illegally altering a document in this very case. He manipulated a classified agency email to conceal the vital fact that Carter Page had been actively cooperating with American intelligence rather than working against it. The secretive surveillance court itself eventually issued highly unprecedented public rebuke. The presiding judge stated, on the record, that the investigative agency had actively misled the court in the carefully measured language of the judiciary. Misled is the polite translation for perjury. The speaker turned his attention back to the chairman senator. Your widely circulated memorandum from February of 2018 unequivocally stated, and I will quote it precisely, federal officials did not abuse the surveillance process, omit material information, or subvert this vital tool. Every single word composing that sentence has been historically proven false. The authorities absolutely abused the process. They purposefully omitted highly material information on 17 separate occasions, and a federal attorney stood in a court of law and admitted to fabricating evidence. Your official memo did not simply contain minor inaccuracies, it actively provided political cover for the gross abuse of governmental surveillance powers deployed against an innocent American citizen. Carter Page was forced to pay the ultimate price. He forfeited his career, his life savings, his panoply, pristine reputation, and his elderly mother's peace of everyday mind, all of it ruthlessly sacrificed to uphold a political narrative that your own highly cleared witnesses had already confirmed behind closed doors lacked any foundational evidence. You drafted that defensive memo, fully aware of what the officials had testified. You knew they had said no yet. You chose to publish it regardless. Carter Page calmly stood up. He methodically buttoned his suit jacket, an ingrained reflexive gesture belonging to a man who had been raised to show unwavering respect for solemn institutions, even when those very institutions had catastrophically failed him. As he quietly walked back to his assigned seat, his path took him past the gallery, where he briefly locked eyes with Richard Kovach. Neither man uttered a single word, yet a profound unspoken recognition passed between them. The unique, tragic understanding shared exclusively by individuals who have been quietly devastated by the exact same systemic machinery, albeit in entirely different ways, and for entirely different reasons, but always with the same powerful hands. Resting upon the control levers, reaching beneath his desk, the host produced an electronic tablet. He held it aloft to ensure the broadcasting cameras could clearly capture the screen, and then he positioned it facing the committee members. "Mr. Chairman, I wish to play a brief video clip for the official record. It is widely accessible to the public and has amassed over 40 million views. The footage originates from a specific committee hearing held on September 26, 2019, which was chaired at that precise moment by the DAR senator seated before me." He tapped the screen. The room's audio speakers immediately projected a voice that every person present instantly recognized. It was the chairman's voice, adopting a highly confident theatrical cadence as he read aloud what he explicitly presented to the public as the factual substance of a diplomatic phone call between the American executive and the leader of Ukraine. "I have a favor I want from you." Though the recorded voice echoed through the chamber, and I am going to say this only 7 times, so you better listen. Good. I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent. Understand? Lots of it on this and on that. The video was paused. The chamber remained perfectly still. Frozen on the tablet screen was the image of the chairman mid-sentence, his hand dramatically raised, his gaze fixed purposefully above the lens. Those were never the actual words spoken, the host stated firmly. The executive leader never uttered the phrase, "make up dirt." He never stated, "I am going to say this only 7 times." He never commanded, "You better listen." Good. None of those aggressive phrases appear anywhere within the official declassified transcript of the conversation. The administration had released the exact verbatim transcript to the public the previous day. Every journalist operating in the Capitol had read it. Every standing member of the Intelligence Committee possessed full access to it. Yet the chairman of that vital committee, the single individual entrusted with safeguarding the most sensitive clandestine operations in the Republic, stood before the legislative body and the American people on live, unedited television, and confidently recited a completely fabricated, fictionalized version of a diplomatic communication. He held up 2 printed documents. I hold the genuine official transcript in my left hand. In my right, I hold the transcript of the dramatic performance the senator provided. Allow me to compare them directly. The actual verified words were, "I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it." The senator's invented version was, "I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent, understand? Lots of it. I implore you to recognize the vast discrepancy." One text illustrates a broad request concerning an ongoing investigation. The other depicts an aggressive, corrupt demand for fabricated evidence. One scenario represents a political maneuver, while the other implies a severe criminal act. The individual holding the gavel presented the criminal interpretation, the version he wholly invented, as if it were the undeniable truth, when a fellow representative directly confronted him on the floor asking, "Is he simply inventing this?" The senator was forced to admit on camera that his dramatic recitation was, to quote him directly, meant to be, at least in part, parody. The host set the papers down softly. Parody. The chairman of the most sensitive Intelligence Committee, operating during a deeply serious constitutional proceeding, chose to perform a theatrical parody on live television for millions of trusting citizens actively withholding the fact that it was pure fiction until he was decisively caught in the act. In a traditional courtroom, the presentation of intentionally fabricated evidence is legally defined as fraud. Within the walls of Congress, you casually brushed it off as parody. One must wonder what terminology you would apply if someone subjected you to such an experience. He did not pause to allow for an answer pressing forward, because the intricate narrative he was constructing demanded one final crucial element. Regrettably, that was not the solitary occasion where you injected fiction into an official proceeding masquerading as absolute fact. 2 years prior, in March of 2017, you stood upon the official floor of the House of Representatives and enthusiastically read aloud. From a highly controversial dossier, you legally cemented its salacious claims into the congressional record, which serves as the permanent historical archive of the United States. Allow me to illuminate the true nature of the document you bestowed. With such historical permanence, the dossier was assembled by a former foreign intelligence officer. It was entirely funded by the opposing political organization through a network of legal and research firms. The primary source providing the information was a foreign national who subsequently confessed to federal agents that a vast majority of his explosive contributions were firmly rooted in mere rumor, casual speculation, and in his own explicit words, conversation over drinks, speculation over alcoholic beverages. That is the exact evidentiary standard of the document you officially read into the permanent, unalterable historical record of this nation. He raised 3 fingers to visually punctuate his next point. Let us examine 3 specific explosive claims from that document, which you immortalized in the record, and review how history judged them. First claim: a prominent legal representative traveled to Prague to secretly coordinate election interference with foreign operatives. The extensive special counsel investigation definitively confirmed that this individual never set foot in Prague, legally proving he was thousands of miles away. In California, when the alleged meeting occurred, the claim was entirely fabricated. Second claim: foreign intelligence had been actively cultivating the political figure as an asset for over half a decade. Following years of exhaustive investigations by multiple special counsels, not a single shred of corroborating evidence was ever discovered to substantiate this theory. It was unequivocally false. Third claim: a deeply entrenched, well-developed conspiracy of active cooperation existed between the campaign and foreign leadership. The very individual who originally supplied this explosive claim to the author eventually admitted, under aggressive questioning, that he possessed zero factual evidence to back it up. He was merely guessing, based on casual barroom chatter. 3 monumental claims, all conclusively proven false. Yet all 3 were permanently entered by you into the official historical record of the United States, where they will forever reside alongside our most sacred founding documents. These were dramatic fabrications sourced from a man who admitted he was blindly guessing, financially backed by political rivals, and enthusiastically amplified by the individual holding the gavel of the Test Intelligence Committee. And years later, when an independent special counsel report conclusively demonstrated that federal agencies knew the document was dangerously unreliable. From the start, you brazenly dismissed the comprehensive report as flawed. You labeled the exhaustive multi-year investigation a big bust. The special counsel who spent years analyzing the data was allegedly wrong. The Inspector General who documented the 17 severe errors was wrong. The team of annotation Investigators who found zero evidence of a conspiracy were wrong. The highest-ranking intelligence officials who testified no under oath were all wrong. According to your narrative, Senator, every single professional involved was incorrect with the sole exception of yourself. What transpired next caught everyone in the chamber entirely off guard, including the seasoned media host, the chairman, had remained steadfastly quiet for nearly 40 minutes. His legal counsel had whispered urgently into his ear. His staff members had nervously passed handwritten notes. Through it all, he had sat rigidly, with his hands tightly folded, arranging his facial features into the carefully practiced expression of a statesman, enduring a highly unpleasant, yet ultimately temporary, inconvenience. He wore the distinct visage of a seasoned politician, determined to silently weather a passing storm. However, something deeply embedded within the final segment of the critique, perhaps the invocation of the dossier, the sanctity of the congressional record, or simply the crushing accumulation of 40 minutes of unrelenting, irrefutable evidence, piling up like heavy snow upon a fragile roof, caused a profound internal shift. The chairman aggressively leaned forward. His attorney quickly placed a cautioning hand upon his forearm, but he forcefully shook it away. Mr. Chairman, I demand the opportunity to formally respond. The presiding official glanced toward the host. The host offered a calm nod. Senator, you are welcome to respond. The politician turned his gaze toward his adversary, and for the very first time during the lengthy proceeding, he no longer sounded like a carefully managed public figure, reciting a vetted statement. He sounded distinctly like a man who had absorbed a devastating blow and was wildly striking back, in sheer self-preservation. Let me pose a direct question to you. He started. His vocal tone radically altered, growing sharper and entirely stripped of its usual bureaucratic polish. What lay beneath the veneer was something raw, visceral, and considerably more dangerous, the primal survival instinct of an individual who has survived 3 decades in the political arena and instinctively understands that the most effective defense mechanism is a vicious counteroffensive, targeted directly at the Talger opponent's perceived vulnerability. You are the co-founder of a highly lucrative media enterprise, he accused. It is reportedly valued in the hundreds of millions. Your organization mass-produces digital broadcasts, cinematic films, and most profitably, sheer political outrage. Your personal viewing audience extends well beyond 15 million individuals across various digital platforms. Every single time my name or image is featured within your programming, your engagement metrics skyrocket. Your analytical staff meticulously tracks these statistics. You are perfectly aware of exactly how much financial value my name adds to your corporate bottom line. He paused not for a theatrical flourish, but to ensure his final strike landed with maximum destructive precision. So allow me to ask you directly, are you genuinely sitting here today in the pursuit of righteous accountability? Or are you simply here to harvest profitable content? The allied section of the gallery immediately erupted into thunderous applause, peppered with sharp, mocking laughter. It was the distinct, approving cheer of a crowd that genuinely believes a knockout blow has just been successfully delivered. And for a fleeting moment, a profoundly brief fraction of time lasting no more than 3 seconds, yet long enough for every high-definition camera in the room to permanently capture the relentless. Interviewer lacked a response. He sat perfectly still. His mouth, which had been eloquently delivering facts at a pace the official stenographer could scarcely track for nearly an hour, was suddenly closed. His eyes, which had been fiercely locked onto his target with the intensity of a Seasoned prosecutor blinked once in quiet processing. Up in the viewing gallery, Richard Kovach felt a sudden sickening drop in his stomach. He had driven 11 exhausting hours. He had worn the suit from his wife's funeral. He had sat patiently through 40 minutes of methodical evidence that finally validated everything he had known to be true, and everything his beloved son had stubbornly refused to accept. Yet now, the politician was viciously fighting back, and the brilliant speaker was sitting in silence. 3 seconds elapsed. The crowded gallery held its collective breath. 28 million citizens watched intently from their homes. The stenographer's hands hovered anxiously over her keyboard. The broadcast cameras slowly zoomed in on the host's face, eagerly searching for the inevitable crack, waiting for the pivotal moment when the fastest mind in political media discovered that sheer velocity was no longer sufficient. At 4 seconds, he released a slow, measured exhale. It was a subtle noise, reminiscent of the deep breath a prizefighter takes in the corner of the ring. Between grueling rounds, a necessary reset, a mental recalibration, a distinct dividing line, separating the events that had just transpired from the devastating response that was about to be unleashed. "Senator," he replied calmly, "that is an entirely fair question." The entire gallery fell instantly silent. Even his fiercest detractors quieted down, shocked that he had seemingly conceded the premise of the attack. "Yes, the media company I helped build is valued at a significant sum. Yes, generating political content fundamentally drives audience engagement. Yes, utilizing your name and actions invariably generates digital traffic. Every single axionised aspect of your statement is factually correct. And yet, absolutely none of those facts alter a single piece of evidence I have meticulously presented to this committee today. However, since you have opened the door to this inquiry, allow me to clearly articulate the fundamental difference that exists between you and myself. It is a remarkably simple distinction. When I discover that I am factually incorrect, I publicly admit that I am wrong." He held the politician's gaze without wavering. "In the year 2016, I publicly declared that I could not support the nominee of my own party. I stated my position loudly and clearly. As a direct result, I lost a massive portion of my audience. I lost major corporate advertisers. I lost a tremendous amount of personal income. I made the statement regardless, because I genuinely believed it to be the truth at that specific moment in time. Years later, as circumstances evolved, I fundamentally changed my position. I announced that evolution publicly as well. Consequently, I was heavily criticized by the very people who had loudly applauded my original stance. I accepted their harsh criticism gracefully, because that is the inevitable consequence of prioritizing the pursuit of facts over the comfort of a preferred narrative. I was factually wrong regarding the geopolitical outcomes of conflicts in the Middle East, and I have openly admitted as much on the permanent record. On multiple occasions I have been factually incorrect regarding specific legislative predictions, electoral outcomes, and the character of various individuals. And in every single instance I have openly admitted my errors. Not because it felt comfortable, but because acknowledging the truth is paramount." He leaned slightly closer to his microphone. "Can you provide one example, Senator? Can you name one single instance over the course of the last 6 years where you publicly admitted you were entirely wrong about the existence of international collusion? Can you point to one single press conference, one solitary interview, one brief social media post, or even one simple sentence? Just one?" The chairman slightly opened his mouth, then slowly closed it. In that quiet, defeated gesture, the silent opening and closing of a mouth that had previously spoken 447 times on television regarding phantom evidence that never materialized, the proceedings were effectively concluded. The speaker nodded slowly. That is precisely what I anticipated. You questioned whether I am sitting here for content or for accountability. The genuine answer is that I am here because someone had to finally ask you the critical question that 447 media interviewers completely failed to ask. I am here today because an honorable man named Carter Page was stripped of his career, his life savings, and his elderly mother's peace of mind, all based upon a surveillance warrant that your official memorandum falsely assured the public was ethically sound. I am here because $32 million of the taxpayers' hard-earned money was squandered, investigating a vast conspiracy that 5 of your own highly cleared witnesses explicitly told you did not exist. And yes, Senator, my media organization will absolutely clip the footage of this hearing, and millions of citizens will watch it. That is simply the mechanical nature of modern media. You understand that dynamic far better than anyone else in this room. You spent 6 long years utilizing major networks to seamlessly broadcast your preferred narrative. The crucial difference is that my distributed clips will contain verifiable truth, whereas yours demonstrably did not. The viewing gallery did not erupt in applause this time. Instead, it did something infinitely more powerful. It descended into an absolute suffocating silence. It was the profound quiet of a room that has just witnessed a fundamental shift, not merely in the trajectory of a political hearing, but in the very atmosphere itself. The equilibrium of power had irreparably changed, and every soul present could physically feel it. It was akin to sensing the sudden drop in barometric pressure. Just moments before a violent storm, or feeling a massive architectural bridge silently settle beneath an unbearable weight. It was the distinct emotional frequency of realizing that the opposition has definitively lost the battle and has simply not yet determined how to gracefully accept their defeat. The chairman slowly sank back into his leather chair. His legal counsel leaned in once again. This time, the whispered interaction was not a tactical suggestion. It was an urgent inquiry. Based upon the clear movement of the attorney's lips, captured seamlessly by the high-definition cameras in the front row, the question appeared to be, "Do you want to end this right now?" The chairman subtly shook his head. He did not refuse because he possessed a burning desire to continue the fight, but because he understood that fleeing the room in this moment would be infinitely more devastating than enduring the remainder of the humiliation. The speaker seamlessly transitioned into his concluding remarks, and the entire room immediately noticed a distinct change in his demeanor. For the first time in over an hour and a half, the famously rapid speaker slowed his tempo significantly. His delivery became incredibly deliberate. The sentence was presented as a complete, weighty thought. Every concept was granted the necessary oxygen to breathe and resonate. The official stenographer, whose fingers had been an absolute blur for a better part of the morning, suddenly found that she could keep pace with ease. This was because the host was no longer engaged in a performance. He was delivering a solemn verdict. On the 21st of June, 2023, the United States House of Representatives officially voted to formally censure you, Senator. The final tally was 213 to 209. It marked only the third occasion in 2 decades that a sitting member of the legislative body had faced such a severe reprimand. The official resolution of censure explicitly stated, and I stress that these are not my personal words, but the formal language adopted by a voting majority of the House, that you purposely deceived his committee, Congress, and the American people, purposely deceived. Those specific words are now permanently etched into the official historical record of this republic. The resolution further noted that you occupied highly sensitive positions of extreme public trust, which granted you access to heavily classified intelligence unavailable to the vast majority of your peers, and that you flagrantly abused this sacred trust by continually alleging you possessed evidence of a conspiracy that, as has been made abundantly clear by the exhaustive reports of a special counsel, the Department of Justice, Inspector General, and an independent investigator, never actually existed. 3. Entirely separate investigations. 3. Entirely separate, massive reports. 3. Entirely separate, definitive conclusions, all yielding the exact same truth. He calmly closed his thick binder. He placed both hands flat upon the polished wooden table and gazed at the politician with an expression devoid of fiery anger, arrogant triumph, or bitter contempt. Instead, his look closely mirrored the somber expression a seasoned surgeon adopts when quietly informing a family that the lengthy operation is over, and the tragic results are exactly what everyone had deeply feared. Senator, I wish to share something with you, and I genuinely want you to absorb it, not as a combative political opponent, nor as a media personality, but simply as a fellow citizen of the nation. You were elected to protect and serve, were presented with a clear choice every single morning for 6 long years. You possessed the honorable option to face the press and state, the federal investigation is currently ongoing. I am legally prohibited from discussing classified materials, and I place my trust in the judicial process. That is precisely what responsible public officials say. That is what the strict protocols of the intelligence community demand. That is what your sworn oath of office required of you. Instead, you actively chose to say more. You actively chose to assure the public that you held the evidence. You deliberately selected the word direct. You deliberately utilized the phrase in plain sight. You willingly chose to make 447 media appearances because every single broadcast elevated your public profile, dramatically boosted your campaign. Fundraising expanded your national stature and systematically moved you one step closer to securing the powerful Senate seat you currently occupy. He let out a slow breath. This relentless fabricated narrative did not merely inflict political damage upon a sitting executive. It inflicted profound damage upon the very fabric of our country. It squandered $32 million of the taxpayers' hard-earned wealth. It completely consumed 2 vital years of the nation's collective attention, time, and energy that desperately needed to be directed toward failing infrastructure, healthcare reform, and a devastating opioid epidemic that was actively claiming American lives. While the Capitol endlessly debated a fictional conspiracy, it ruthlessly destroyed an innocent man's career and shattered his elderly mother's peace. It financially decimated public servants. Most tragically, it tore apart genuine families, real people, much like those sitting quietly in this very gallery today, permanently ceased speaking to their loved ones because one faction implicitly trusted your words, and the other faction did not. Neither side could conclusively prove the other wrong, simply because you had strategically locked the exculpatory evidence behind a wall of classified secrecy. You successfully weaponized the classification system, Senator. You utilized the necessary times secrecy of our intelligence apparatus as a personal political shield. You repeatedly informed the American public that you had seen terrifying things they were legally forbidden to view, and you essentially dared them to doubt your integrity. And years later, when those transcripts were finally unsealed, and the public could clearly read that the highest witnesses had told you, no, you offered no apologies. You made no effort to correct the historical record. You simply branded the lawn, investigations as flawed, dismissed your official censure as mere political theater, and successfully campaigned for higher office. He paused one final time. The legislative chamber was so profoundly silent that the subtle cycling of the ventilation system sounded incredibly loud. The faint, persistent hum of the overhead lighting was clearly audible. Even the muffled sounds of city traffic navigating Constitution Avenue 7 floors below seemed to echo through the room, continuing its endless rhythm, entirely indifferent to the dramatic unraveling of a legacy occurring within the hearing room. I have a specific phrase that I utilize quite frequently, Senator. You have likely heard it, as have most citizens. The phrase is, "Facts do not care about your feelings." I have repeated it thousands of times. I have said it so frequently that it has morphed into a cultural joke, a digital meme, a predictable punchline. However, today I wish to offer a dark, slightly different variation of that sentiment. Facts do not care about your political career. They do not care about your prestigious committee assignments. They are entirely indifferent to your lucrative cable news bookings, your urgent fundraising emails, or the Senate seat you hold. True facts are incredibly patient. They do not require the immediate validation of the Problem C or Choir 22, the daily news cycle. They do not desperately seek high television ratings. They simply wait. They waited patiently through 2 grueling years of the initial special counsel. They waited through 3 exhausting years of independent audits. They waited silently through 447 of your television appearances, and they are still sitting right here, inside this very room, resting upon this table, bound within these declassified transcripts. The supposed evidence never existed, Senator. You knew it from the start. The sworn witnesses explicitly told you so. The official reports definitively confirmed it. Yet on 447 separate occasions, you lied to the American people anyway. He allowed that final devastating word to hang, suspended in the air. Lied. Not merely misled. Not slightly overstated. Not accidentally mischaracterized. Lied. The heavy accusation hung over the chamber like thick smoke, and you did so. Not because you genuinely believed the falsehood, but simply because the lie was effective. The presiding chairman awkwardly cleared his throat, shattering the spell. The chair formally notes for the official record that this committee will immediately refer the substantive matters discussed today to the Senate Ethics Committee for comprehensive review. This hearing is officially adjourned. The wooden gavel struck the block. What unfolded in the immediate aftermath was neither loud nor dramatic. In truth, it was something far worse. It was exceptionally quiet. 2 allied senators, one hailing from the Midwest, the other from the Northeast, neither of whom would ever be explicitly named in the subsequent press reports, because the political elite fiercely protects its own, silently rose from their leather chairs and began walking, purposefully toward the chamber exits. As they passed by the chairman, they did not offer a glance in his direction. They did not nod in solidarity. They did not pause to offer comfort. They simply walked right past him, adopting the exact demeanor of pedestrians, quickly bypassing a structure they have suddenly realized is no longer structurally sound. They moved with immense purpose, with notable haste, their eyes fixed firmly upon the heavy wooden doors. The chairman's chief of staff was already pressing a mobile phone to his ear. The hushed conversation was incredibly brief. The expression painted across his face was the grim visage of a loyal subordinate receiving urgent directives he deeply despises but is forced to execute. He ended the call, leaned closely into his superior, and whispered three urgent words that numerous digital lip-reading experts would later decipher from the archived footage. "We need to go." The chairman stood up. He mechanically straightened his silk tie. He began gathering his scattered documents with the unhurried, forced precision of a man desperately attempting to project to the watching cameras that he was casually departing rather than actively fleeing. Yet his hands betrayed him. They were shaking. It was not a violent, dramatic tremor, but just enough of a subtle vibration that the edges of his papers visibly fluttered as he attempted to neatly align them. It was just enough of a tremor for the high-speed lenses in the front row to perfectly capture the moment. It was just enough that by the time evening fell, that highly specific image would dominate nearly every digital screen across the ball nation, a powerful politician's hands visibly trembling over a stack of meaningless papers that possessed no power to save him. At exactly 47 minutes past 6 o'clock that evening, parked quietly in a desolate rest stop along Interstate 70, somewhere in the vast stretch between Zanesville and Columbus, Ohio, a 63-year-old man sat alone in the cab of his truck. The engine was gently idling, the heater was softly blowing warm air, and he held his mobile phone tightly in his weathered hand. Richard Kovach had been sitting in that exact position for over 20 minutes. He had been driving steadily, since the dramatic hearing concluded, heading westward on the highway, making his way back to his quiet life in Youngstown. However, shortly after passing the Zanesville exit, he had been forced to pull onto the shoulder because his hands were simply trembling too severely to safely grip the dollar's steering wheel. It was not the explosive nature of the hearing that had so deeply shaken him. He had fully anticipated the drama of the proceedings. After all, he had driven 11 hours specifically to bear witness to it. What he had entirely failed to anticipate was the crushing emotional wave that crashed over him in the aftermath. It was the highly specific, overwhelmingly isolating sensation of realizing he had been absolutely right for 6 agonizing years, while simultaneously understanding that being right had cost him the most precious thing in his world. He realized with devastating clarity that no amount of political vindication, not a fiery congressional hearing, not an official resolution of censure, not a massive binder overflowing with declassified proof, possessed the magical ability to rewind time. Nothing could restore the lost Thanksgiving dinners, the silent Christmas mornings, the unmade phone calls, or the painfully ordinary Tuesday evenings when a loving father might simply call his grown son for no grand reason other than to hear his familiar voice. His phone screen was brightly illuminated, opened directly to David's contact profile. He had painstakingly typed a brief 4-word message. "Did you see it?" He stared at the glowing letters, then slowly deleted them. He typed the exact same words once more, only to erase them again. He sat in the darkened parking lot, listening to the rhythmic hum of the truck's engine and the gentle rush of the heater, watching massive commercial vehicles roar past on the interstate, hauling endless cargo to distant destinations that held absolutely no meaning to him. He was 63 years old. He had honorably served his country in the military. He had endured grueling 30-hour physical shifts at the local stamping plant, keep his family afloat during the crushing financial collapse of 2008. He had buried his beloved wife and managed to deliver a beautiful, coherent eulogy without his voice shattering. Yet, the simple act of dialing his estranged son's phone number demanded a unique, terrifying brand of courage that none of those prior hardships had adequately prepared him for. Navigating military protocols, surviving factory shifts, and delivering eulogies all operate under clear, established rules. You understand the expectations, and you simply follow the procedure. There exists no established protocol for reaching out to a child who genuinely believes you have betrayed your country. With a trembling finger, he typed those 4 simple words one final time. Did you see it? This time, he refused to delete them. He closed his eyes and firmly pressed the send icon. He immediately tossed the device onto the passenger seat, tightly gripped the steering wheel with both hands, and waited in the darkness. 3 agonizing minutes slowly ticked by. The engine continued its soft idle. A massive semi-truck pulled into the rest area, its heavy air brakes hissing loudly as it parked merely 4 spaces away. The exhausted driver climbed out of the cab, walked slowly toward the facilities, eventually returned, climbed back inside, and drove off into the night. Within the brief span of time it took for that complete stranger to execute such a mundane, ordinary routine, Richard Kovach mentally relived every single conversation he and David had tragically missed out on over the past 3 years. Suddenly, the screen illuminated the dark cab. The phone began to ring. It was not a sterile text message in response. It was an active phone call. David was calling him. Richard reached across the seat and picked up the device. His hand remained unsteady. He pressed the green icon to accept the call, slowly raised the speaker to his ear, and remained entirely silent. For 4 seconds, David also said nothing. Those 4 agonizing seconds of silence perfectly encapsulated 3 long years of bitter estrangement, spanning 2 highly divisive election cycles, a terrifying global health crisis, 1 deeply sorrowful funeral that David had refused to attend, and 1 painfully quiet Thanksgiving table featuring an empty chair. Neither man spoke a word. They simply breathed. It was the raw, unfiltered sound of a father and his son cautiously sharing the same air, across a digital connection, arguably the most ordinary sound in existence, yet simultaneously most profoundly precious. Finally, David broke the silence. He spoke just 2 words uttered with the quiet, fragile hesitation of someone who has mentally rehearsed a phrase 1,000 times, only to find it emerges sounding incredibly small and vulnerable when finally spoken aloud. "I'm sorry." Richard slowly closed his eyes. In that beautiful, fleeting instant, the cold parking lot vanished from his mind. The roaring trucks faded away. The endless interstate dissolved into nothingness. The explosive hearing, the brilliant media, host the disgraced politician, the countless investigations, the 447 broadcasted, lies the 17. Documented errors, all of it completely evaporated into the ether. The only thing that remained in the universe was the sound of a son's voice speaking the exact 2 words that Richard had fiercely forbidden himself from ever hoping to hear. He had suppressed that hope because hoping was simply too agonizing, and suffering further disappointment was a luxury he could no longer survive, not at the age of 63, and certainly not while entirely alone. He did not reply with, "I told you so." That specific vindictive phrase had been readily available to him for over 3 years, yet he had, quote, never once entertained the thought of utilizing it. He did not say, "I forgive you," because the concept of forgiveness inherently implies the existence of an unpaid debt, and Richard adamantly refused to view his only child as someone who owed him anything. He said absolutely nothing regarding the hearing, the evidence, the political narratives, or any of The toxic vocabulary that had poisoned the vital space between them since that fateful evening in November of 2019, instead he offered a simple request. Come home for Easter. 4 simple words. That was the entirety of his response. Come home for Easter. It is perhaps the most uncomplicated, beautiful sentiment in the human language. A warm invitation to share a holiday, representing an unconditionally open door. On the other end of the line, David emitted a sudden, overwhelmed sound. It was not a recognizable word. Rather, it was something caught precariously between a deep breath and a quiet sob. It was the profoundly human sound a 34-year-old man makes at the exact moment he fully realizes that the father he had angrily abandoned 3 years prior had been patiently waiting for him. Every single day, since keeping the front door permanently unlocked, ensuring the chair at the dining table remained open and leaving the invitation to return forever standing. "Okay," David managed to whisper. "Okay," Richard echoed softly. And in that moment, that was more than enough. Miles away in the evening sky, the media host did not bother to check his mobile device for breaking news updates. He sat quietly on a commercial flight, returning to his home in Nashville, keeping his laptop firmly closed. His gaze remained fixed upon the small window, peacefully watching the sprawling Maryland suburbs slowly transition into the rugged, beautiful ridgelines of the Appalachian Mountains, which eventually gave way to the sprawling, shadowed plateaus of West Virginia, melting into Kentucky, and ultimately leading him back to Tennessee, back to his home. As the landscape rolled beneath him, he reflected upon a profound piece of wisdom his spiritual mentor had shared with him many years prior, during a deep conversation regarding the fundamental nature of truth and the immense patience it inherently demands. The truth, his mentor had gently explained, does not require a loud, booming voice to sustain itself. It does not need to aggressively dominate the daily news cycle. It does not need to artificially trend on digital platforms. It truly requires only one specific thing to survive. It needs just one courageous individual willing to stand up and speak it out loud, within a room where the consequences genuinely matter, looking directly into the eyes of the person who has dedicated their life to denying it. He had accomplished precisely that. Today, he had not done so at the frantic pace of a daily broadcast, nor at the combative speed of a political debate. He had not spoken with the cadence of an entertainer seeking the validation of a cheering crowd. He had spoken with the measured, deliberate pacing of an individual who had exhaustively read every single unsealed transcript, every dense investigative report, every buried footnote, every sworn deposition, and every declassified document. He had spoken with the cold, immovable certainty of a highly trained legal mind who had spent 6 grueling years meticulously building an airtight case, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that the promised evidence had never truly existed. It was never there. And somewhere down below, traveling along Interstate 70, somewhere between a quiet rest stop in rural Ohio and a small, modest apartment in Columbus, a father and a son were engaged in a meaningful conversation for the very first time. In over 1,000 days, they were not fiercely debating national politics. They were not arguing about foreign influence, massive intelligence committees, or historic censure resolutions. They were happily discussing the upcoming Easter holiday. They were debating what side dishes to prepare and playfully arguing over whether Richard still remembered how to cook the traditional family recipes exactly the way their late mother used to prepare them. They were talking about absolutely nothing, of grand historical consequence, which meant they were finally talking about everything that genuinely mattered. They were able to heal because the political evidence that broke them apart was never there. It was never truly there. The only organized deception that had ever been conclusively proven was the massive effort designed to make the American public believe an absolute falsehood. It was a falsehood that had squandered $32 million of public resources, entirely consumed 2 years of the nation's collective focus, destroyed the brilliant career of a naval officer, wiped out the life, savings of dedicated public servants, severely damaged the foundational trust of an entire generation, and caused 3 agonizing years of dead silence between a loving father and his only son. The evidence was never there.